October 24th, 1942. On Guadalcanal, the sun sets on the American perimeter. For the Marines of Chesty Puller's battalion, the jungle is an ominous wall of silence. But they are not alone. Just beyond the wire, thousands of elite Japanese soldiers from the Sendai Division are making their final preparations. Their commanders are certain of victory. By dawn, they believe, Henderson Field will be theirs. They have not accounted for the man from Raritan, New Jersey, and the 2 machine guns he calls his own. This was more than just a battle for a strip of dirt and steel matting carved from the jungle. Henderson Field was the strategic heart of the American presence in the Solomon Islands. Since the Marines had landed on August 7th, this airfield had been their lifeline and their fortress. It allowed American aircraft to contest the skies, to strike at Japanese shipping, and to prevent the enemy from isolating Australia. To lose Henderson Field was to lose Guadalcanal. To lose Guadalcanal was to risk losing the war in the Pacific. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army, understood this calculus perfectly. He intended to rip that heart out. His plan was born from a fatal combination of confidence and poor intelligence. He believed his forces, built around the elite Sendai Division, now significantly outnumbered the fever-ridden, beleaguered American defenders. He envisioned a grand, coordinated offensive, a multi-pronged assault designed to crush the Marine perimeter in a single, decisive blow. But at the core of his strategy lay a deeper conviction, a philosophy that defined the Imperial Japanese Army. It was the unwavering belief in the supremacy of fighting spirit, the idea that the sheer will and moral force of the Japanese soldier, steeped in the warrior code of Bushido, could overcome any material disadvantage. Logistics, firepower, defensive preparations, these were secondary concerns to the raw power of a bayonet charge delivered with unshakable resolve. His main effort would be a frontal assault, a human wave aimed directly at the thinly held southern flank of the American line, commanded by a man who was himself a living embodiment of the Marine Corps' own fighting spirit, Lieutenant Colonel Louis B. Chesty Puller. The instrument of Hyakutake's will was the Sendai Division, led by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama. These were not conscripts. They were seasoned veterans of the war in China, a proud and formidable fighting force. For days they had been hacking their way through the island's densest jungle, a nightmarish march that left them exhausted and short on supplies, but their morale was high. They were on the cusp of what they believed would be the final, glorious battle for the island. Their reconnaissance of the American lines had been hasty, almost non-existent. They saw a simple line of foxholes and assumed it was weak. They failed to grasp the interlocking fields of fire, the carefully placed machine guns, and the strands of barbed wire hidden in the kunai grass. They saw only an obstacle to be overcome by momentum and shock. On the other side of that line, the men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, waited. They were ghosts of the men who had landed 2 months prior. Their uniforms were ragged, their bodies thin from meager rations, and their blood thrummed with malaria. But under Chesty Puller's command, they had transformed their small sector of the Lunga perimeter into a fortress of earth and steel. They had dug deep, cleared lanes for their automatic weapons, and registered artillery on every likely avenue of approach. They knew the enemy was coming. The jungle, which had been a constant, oppressive presence, now held a new kind of silence, a coiled tension that promised violence. And at the very epicenter of this impending collision, Sergeant John Basilone was making his final checks. Known as Manila John for his pre-war service in the Philippines, Basilone was a professional soldier to his core. He wasn't an officer driven by grand strategy. He was a non-commissioned officer, a master of his craft. His craft was the M99 117A1 30 caliber heavy machine gun. He commanded 2 sections, a small handful of men whose job was to anchor the battalion's defense. The water-cooled barrels of their guns gave them the ability to maintain a terrifying rate of sustained fire, to turn a jungle trail into an impassable wall of lead. As darkness consumed the island, Basilone moved between his gun pits, his voice calm and steady, checking ammunition belts, ensuring the water cans for the cooling jackets were full, and offering a quiet word of encouragement to his young Marines. He knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a defensive line. It was the final barrier between Maruyama's division and Henderson Field, and he was standing right in the middle of it. The fate of the campaign, and perhaps much more, would be decided here, in the mud and the dark, by the clash of 2 irreconcilable doctrines of war. The first probing attacks began as a whisper, not a roar, a single shot cracking through the humid night air, followed by a scattering of return fire. Japanese soldiers, masters of infiltration, slipped through the shadows, testing the American wire for weaknesses, their movements barely disturbing the thick undergrowth. Inside the Marine perimeter, every snapping twig, every rustle of a palm frond sent jolts of adrenaline through the exhausted defenders. They had been on this island for months, fighting a war not just against the Japanese, but against the environment itself, the constant damp, the swarms of insects, the tropical diseases that sapped their strength more effectively than any enemy bullet. But tonight was different. The sporadic contact soon gave way to a more ominous sound. The thud of mortars and the distant crumping boom of the Japanese type 92 150mm howitzer, the infamous Pistol Pete firing from the hills. Shells began to whistle overhead, searching for artillery positions and command posts, their explosions ripping through the jungle canopy with terrifying shrieks. This was the overture to the main assault. Lieutenant General Maruyama's plan was predicated on speed and overwhelming force. He had divided his Sendai division into 3 columns, all converging on a narrow front along the Lunga River. Their objective was a low, grassy ridge that formed the spine of the American defense. They were to charge through the wire, overrun the Marine foxholes, and keep going until they were standing on the tarmac of Henderson Field. The Japanese doctrine of the night attack was a fearsome thing. It relied on surprise, ferocity, and the psychological shock of a massed bayonet charge, the banzai, erupting from the darkness. It was a tactic that had served them well across Asia and the Pacific, shattering colonial armies and local defenders with its sheer, terrifying momentum. As the artillery barrage intensified, the men of the Sendai Division began to move forward. They advanced in dense columns, a stark violation of modern infantry tactics, but it was central to their belief in concentrating force at the decisive point. They were not skirmishing. They were forming a human battering ram. On the ridge, the Marines gripped their rifles and machine guns, their knuckles white. They could hear them now, a low murmur that grew into a guttural roar. It was a sound that would haunt the nightmares of those who survived it. Thousands of men chanting, screaming, their voices blending into a single, terrifying wave of sound meant to paralyze its victims with fear. For Sergeant Basilone and his men, the moment of truth had arrived. His 2 machine gun sections were positioned at a critical junction, a shallow saddle on the ridge that offered a natural, if suicidal, path of advance for the attackers. His guns, the heavy M1917s, were the linchpins of Chesty Puller's entire defensive scheme. Their interlocking fields of fire were designed to create a kill zone, a meat grinder where any frontal assault would be torn to pieces. Basilone moved from gun to gun, his presence a steadying force for his young, nervous crews. "Let 'em come," he'd mutter, his voice barely audible above the rising din. "Just let 'em get close." Then the first wave broke from the tree line. They were not a cautious advance, but an all-out sprint, a mass of shadows detaching itself from the greater darkness, bayonets fixed and glinting in the light of bursting flares. The Marines held their fire, their discipline absolute. Puller's orders had been clear. Wait until you see them clearly. Wait for the command. Wait for the perfect moment when the charging enemy had committed fully, when they were packed so tightly in the kill zone that every bullet would find a home. The tension stretched to a breaking point. The ground itself seemed to tremble with the pounding of thousands of feet. The air was thick with the screams of "Banzai!" And in that deafening chaos, a single flare popped high above the ridge, casting a brilliant, ghastly white light over the scene. The sight it revealed was apocalyptic. A solid sea of Japanese soldiers, stretching back as far as the eye could see, charging directly at Basilone's position. The time for waiting was over. The command was given, and the ridge erupted in a volcanic roar of coordinated firepower. John Basilone's world narrowed to the space behind his machine gun. The cacophony of the battle, the roar of rifles, the thud of mortars, the screams of the dying faded into a single, continuous, percussive rhythm. It was the rhythm of his M1917, the steady, metronomic chug, chug, chug of the mechanism feeding, firing, and ejecting brass casings in a glittering arc. He wasn't just firing into the darkness. He was painting with tracer rounds, drawing lines of red light across the night that guided the other Marines, stitching patterns of death into the fabric of the charging Japanese wave. The first attackers reached the wire and simply vanished, consumed by the storm of lead. But behind them more came, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, their momentum fueled by a fanaticism the Marines had never before witnessed. They were a tide of men, and Basilone's gun pit was a rock against which that tide was trying to break. For a machine gunner, the enemy is not a collection of individuals. It's a target environment. Basilone and his crews weren't aiming at specific soldiers. They were firing at a concept, the concept of the assault itself. They traversed their guns back and forth in sweeping arcs, scything down the front ranks. But the sheer mass of the Japanese attack was overwhelming. Mortar rounds began to fall with terrifying accuracy, bracketing the machine gun positions. The ground shook with each impact, spraying dirt and shrapnel. One of Basilone's guns was hit directly. A concussive blast threw the crew aside, mangling the weapon and silencing its vital contribution to the defense. The men were dead or wounded, and a gaping hole had just been torn in the American line. Through this new gap, Japanese soldiers began to pour, their bayonets ready. This was the moment where a defensive position typically collapses, the point of penetration that unravels the entire line. But Basilone was not a typical sergeant. Seeing the breach, he reacted with an instinct born of pure combat necessity. He grabbed the other M1917, a weapon that weighed over 40 pounds, not including its tripod and ammunition, and began to move it. This was an act of almost superhuman strength and courage. Under a hail of enemy fire, he repositioned the heavy weapon to a new vantage point, one that could cover the breach left by the destroyed gun. He got it set up in seconds, slammed a new belt of ammunition into the feed tray, and opened fire again. The surprised Japanese soldiers who had broken through were cut down. Their brief moment of success turned into a bloody failure. But the battle was far from over. His remaining gun crew was dwindling. One man was killed by a sniper's bullet. Another fell to shrapnel. Soon, Basilone was operating the gun almost entirely by himself, with just one other Marine left to feed the ammunition belts. He was the gunner, the assistant gunner, and the section leader all at once. He fired in long, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, making every round count. The barrel of the M1917 began to glow a dull red, the water in its cooling jacket boiling away into steam that hissed into the night air. The weapon was on the verge of seizing up, a fatal malfunction, in the heart of the fight. With his bare hands, an act that would sear the skin from his palms, Basilone grabbed the searing hot barrel jacket to guide the gun, ignoring the immense pain, his entire being focused on the singular task of keeping the weapon firing. He knew that the moment this gun fell silent, his position would be overrun, and the line would break for good. He was no longer just a man. He was a component of a weapon system, a living part of the machine, his will and the gun's mechanical action, fused into one single, defiant purpose against the overwhelming tide. Chesty Puller, moving along the line behind his men, witnessed this unfolding drama. He saw the breach. He saw the lone gun firing, and he understood the sacrifice being made. The entire battle for this sector, for the ridge, for Henderson Field, now rested on the shoulders of one sergeant from New Jersey and his last functioning machine gun. The M1917 was a thirsty beast, and its appetite for ammunition was insatiable. Each canvas belt held 250 rounds, a supply that could be exhausted in less than a minute of sustained fire. As the battle raged into its second and then third hour, a new crisis emerged, one more urgent than damaged guns or dwindling manpower. The ammunition was running out. The small supply of belted rounds stored in the gun pit was gone. Basilone and his last remaining crewmen were down to their final belt. A dreadful silence began to fall over their small section of the ridge, a silence that was immediately exploited by the Japanese attackers, who surged forward with renewed vigor. For John Basilone, this was a problem that had to be solved not with tactics, but with sheer physical will. The main ammunition dump was located a significant distance behind the front line, a perilous journey through territory that was now anything but secure. The Japanese, having infiltrated the American lines in several places, had turned the rear areas into a chaotic maze of deadly encounters. Pockets of fighting had erupted all over the jungle behind the main ridge. To go for ammunition was not a simple errand. It was a solo mission through a hornet's nest. Without a moment's hesitation, Basilone made his choice. He handed his .45 caliber pistol to his lone crewman, giving him the only means of self-defense for the position. "Keep them busy," he ordered, his voice raspy from shouting and cordite fumes. "I'll be back." And then he was gone, plunging into the darkness. He ran in a low crouch, his senses on high alert. The jungle, his constant adversary for months, was now actively trying to kill him. Shadows moved where there should have been none. The familiar terrain was made alien by the flashes of explosions and the shifting chaos of the battle. He navigated by instinct, dodging from shell crater to fallen tree, a lone figure moving against the tide of battle. He encountered a small group of Japanese soldiers who had broken through the line. They were disoriented, trying to form up for an attack on the rear. Basilone didn't engage in a firefight. He was a force of nature. He charged through them, using the element of surprise and brute force to scatter them before they could react, and kept running. His objective was singular: the ammo. He reached the dump, a hastily organized collection of wooden crates under a camouflage net. The supply personnel were pinned down, unable to move the ammunition forward. Basilone ignored the incoming fire. He hoisted 2 crates of belted .30 caliber rounds onto his shoulders. Each crate weighed nearly 45 pounds. Carrying a combined weight of approximately 90 pounds, he began the treacherous journey back to his gun. The return trip was a slow, agonizing crawl under an immense burden. The weight of the ammunition dug into his shoulders. His muscles screamed in protest. Every step was a monumental effort. He was a prime target, a slow-moving silhouette in the sporadic light of flares. Bullets snapped past him, and shrapnel from mortar bursts rained down around him. But he never faltered. He was driven by the knowledge that every second he delayed, the men at the front were 1 second closer to being overwhelmed. When he finally staggered back into his gun pit, covered in mud and sweat, he was a vision of unimaginable determination. He dropped the crates, tore them open, and began feeding a fresh belt into the M1970. The gun, which had fallen silent for what seemed like an eternity, roared back to life. Its renewed fire slammed into the advancing Japanese, halting their charge just as they were about to swarm the position. Basilone's single-handed resupply mission had saved the line. But he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The ammunition would not last forever. And so, as soon as the immediate threat was neutralized, he turned and disappeared back into the deadly darkness to do it all over again. Throughout the night, the battle for the ridge became a grim, cyclical ballet of violence. A wave of Japanese soldiers would form in the darkness, surge forward with terrifying banzai cries, and crash against the Marine line. The line would bend, it would threaten to break, but it would hold, anchored by the relentless fire of Basilone's machine gun. And when the gun fell silent for want of ammunition, Basilone himself would become the lifeline, making his perilous journey through the infiltrated jungle, time and time again, to haul back the heavy crates of .30 caliber rounds. This was not a single act of heroism, but a sustained performance of impossible endurance. With each trip, the danger intensified. The Japanese were no longer just on the other side of the wire. They were now a pervasive presence throughout the rear echelons. Basilone fought his way to the ammunition and fought his way back. He used his pistol. He used his bare hands. He used the sheer, intimidating force of his will to get through. He was a one-man logistics chain, a bridge of flesh and bone connecting the dwindling supply of ammunition to the ravenous gun that was keeping his entire sector alive. Inside the gun pit, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Basilone would return, dump the ammunition, and immediately get the gun back into action. As the night wore on, he had to become more than just a gunner and a supply runner. He had to be a mechanic. The M1917, pushed far beyond its operational limits, began to fail. A feeding mechanism jammed, a critical part worn down by the sheer volume of fire. Under the intermittent glare of flares, with enemy soldiers sometimes only yards away, Basilone calmly disassembled the hot, complex weapon. With oil, a cleaning rod, and a practiced touch that seemed impossible in the heat of battle, he cleared the stoppage, reassembled the gun, and brought it back into the fight. His intimate knowledge of his weapon, honed over years of service, was as crucial as his physical courage. He was not just fighting the enemy, he was fighting entropy, the tendency of all machines to break down under the stress of combat. Lieutenant General Maruyama, back at his command post, was receiving confusing and frustrating reports. His commanders at the front, committed to the doctrine of the spirit attack, kept reporting breakthroughs. They would report that they had overrun the American line, that victory was imminent. But the promised collapse never materialized. The relentless hammering sound of one or two heavy machine guns never ceased. They could not understand how such a thin line could withstand the repeated, frenzied assaults of an entire division. Their doctrine had no explanation for this kind of resilience. They had fatally underestimated the material aspect of American warfare. The defensive preparations, the well-sighted guns, and most importantly, the tenacity of the individual Marine. They had believed that spirit could conquer firepower. On this ridge, they were being taught a brutal lesson to the contrary. As dawn approached, casting a pale gray light over the battlefield, the intensity of the Japanese attacks began to wane. Their momentum was broken, their ranks horrifically depleted. The human wave had crashed against an unbreakable wall and had been shattered in the process. The area in front of Basilone's position was a carpet of the dead and dying. The ground was littered with thousands of spent brass casings, a testament to the night's furious work. The barrel of the M1917 was scorched and blackened. The water in the cooling jacket had long since boiled away. John Basilone himself was a figure from a nightmare. His uniform was torn and caked with mud and blood. His face was a mask of grime, cordite, and utter exhaustion. His hands were severely burned from handling the hot metal of his gun. But he was still standing. He and the handful of survivors in his section had held the line. For nearly 48 hours, with little to no sleep, they had faced down one of the most ferocious infantry assaults of the Pacific War and had refused to yield a single inch. When the sun finally rose on October the 26th, it revealed a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. The grassy slope in front of the Marine positions was no longer green, but a nightmarish landscape of twisted bodies. The elite Sendai Division had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Entire battalions had been annihilated, their proud banners lying trampled in the mud. The Japanese had thrown thousands of their best soldiers against Chesty Puller's thin line, and the line had not broken. The final tally was staggering. The Japanese had suffered catastrophic losses, a blow from which their forces on Guadalcanal would never recover. American casualties, while significant, were comparatively light. The battle for Henderson Field was over. It was a decisive, stunning American victory, and it marked the strategic turning point of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The great Japanese offensive had failed, and with it, their last real hope of driving the Americans off the island. In the aftermath, the story of what had happened on that ridge began to spread. Marine after Marine spoke of the sergeant who had refused to quit, the man who had single-handedly kept the guns firing. They told of his Herculean ammunition runs, of him clearing jams under fire, of his burned hands, and of his unshakable calm in the heart of the inferno. Chesty Puller, a commander not given to easy praise, recognized that he had witnessed something extraordinary. He recommended John Basilone for the nation's highest award for valor. The battle was a brutal validation of one military philosophy and a damning indictment of another. The American doctrine, which emphasized integrated defense, superior firepower, and the initiative of the non-commissioned officer, had proven devastatingly effective. The Marines had used their tools, barbed wire, artillery, and especially the heavy machine gun, to multiply the strength of a small number of defenders. They had trusted men like Basilone to understand their role in the larger defensive scheme and to adapt and overcome any obstacle to fulfill that role. Conversely, the engagement exposed the fatal flaws in Japanese military doctrine. Lieutenant General Hyakutake and his staff had fallen victim to their own propaganda. Their belief in the mystical power of fighting spirit had led them to discount the material realities of the modern battlefield. They had launched a frontal assault with poor reconnaissance against a prepared enemy, expecting sheer courage to carry the day. They had treated their soldiers not as skilled infantrymen, but as spiritual ammunition to be expended in human waves. This spirit over steel philosophy had led directly to the destruction of the Sendai Division. They had failed to appreciate that the American soldier, though perhaps less steeped in a formal warrior code, possessed a different kind of resilience, a pragmatic, stubborn refusal to be defeated, backed by immense logistical and industrial power. This clash of doctrines on a muddy ridge in the Solomon Islands was a microcosm of the wider Pacific War. It was a lesson the Japanese military command would fail to learn, repeating the same costly mistakes on islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. For his incredible actions, Sergeant John Basilone was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was no longer an anonymous NCO, he was a national hero. Pulled from the front lines, he was sent back to the United States. His new mission was to tour the country, to be the face of the war effort, to help sell the war bonds that were essential to funding the very industrial might that had helped secure his victory. He was greeted with parades, celebrity endorsements, and the adulation of a grateful nation. But for a man like Basilone, this world of fanfare and public appearances was more alien and uncomfortable than any battlefield. He was a professional soldier, not a celebrity. The cheering crowds and backslapping politicians felt hollow. His place, he felt, was not on a stage, but with his men, with the Marines who were still fighting and dying in the Pacific. The war bond tour was a gilded cage. John Basilone traveled from city to city, standing on brightly lit stages, a tangible symbol of American heroism. He shook hands with mayors, movie stars, and industrialists. He recounted a sanitized version of his story to cheering audiences in factories and town squares. He was instrumental in raising millions of dollars for the war effort. His presence a powerful reminder of what was at stake and the caliber of men fighting for it. But with every speech and every parade, a deep sense of dislocation grew within him. He saw the posters with his face on them, heard the thunderous applause, but felt a profound disconnect. This wasn't his reality. His reality was the smell of cordite, the feel of the M1917's grip in his hands, and the quiet camaraderie of men who depended on each other for their very survival. He was Manila John, a Marine sergeant, and his proper place was with other Marines. The celebrity status chafed against the core of his identity. He was repeatedly offered a commission, a chance to become an officer and serve out the war in a training or administrative role in the United States. It was a safe, respectable path, the logical reward for a Medal of Honor recipient. Basilone refused every time. He saw it as a betrayal of his calling. He hadn't fought on Guadalcanal for fame or a comfortable career. He fought because that was his job, and the job wasn't finished. He began to actively petition the Marine Corps, requesting, then demanding, to be sent back to the front lines. His requests were met with disbelief and resistance. The Marine Corps saw him as an invaluable asset at home, a living, breathing piece of propaganda that was far too valuable to risk in combat. But Basilone was as relentless in his campaign to return to the war as he had been in defending Henderson Field. He argued that his skills and experience were being wasted, that he could do more good training new Marines and leading them in battle than he ever could by selling bonds. Eventually, the Corps relented. They could not, in good conscience, hold a man of his caliber back when he so desperately wanted to fight. His wish was granted. He was assigned to the 5th Marine Division, a new unit forming at Camp Pendleton, California, preparing for the final, bloody push against the Japanese home islands. For Basilone, it was a profound relief, a return to the world he understood. He shed the uncomfortable mantle of celebrity, and once again became what he was meant to be, Sergeant Basilone of the United States Marine Corps. He threw himself into training his new platoon of machine gunners with a ferocious intensity. The men under his command were young, most of them fresh-faced recruits who had never heard a shot fired in anger. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and apprehension. This was the famous John Basilone, the hero of Guadalcanal. They soon discovered he was no remote legend, but a demanding, hands-on leader who drilled them relentlessly. He taught them everything he knew about the machine gun, not just from the training manuals, but from the brutal lessons learned in the jungles of Guadalcanal. He taught them how to clear a jam in total darkness, how to emplace the gun for a perfect field of fire, and how to stay calm when the world was exploding around them. He was preparing them for the horrors he knew awaited them. His destination, and that of the 5th Marine Division, was a tiny, pork-chop-shaped volcanic island of little intrinsic value, save for its 2 airfields. It was a place that would become a byword for unimaginable carnage, a place whose black sands would be soaked in the blood of the Marine Corps. The island was named Iwo Jima. The invasion of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, was unlike anything the Marine Corps had ever experienced. This was not the jungle warfare of Guadalcanal. Iwo Jima was a fortress, a volcanic hellscape transformed by its Japanese defenders into the most formidable defensive network of the Pacific War. The island was a honeycomb of interconnected bunkers, pillboxes, and artillery positions, all dug deep into the rock and volcanic ash. The Japanese commander had abandoned the futile tactic of banzai charges on the beaches. Instead, he had created a defense in depth, designed to inflict the maximum possible casualties on the American invaders and bleed them white. John Basilone and his men landed on Red Beach 2, directly in the shadow of Mount Suribachi. The scene that greeted them was one of apocalyptic chaos. The beach was a churned-up morass of soft, black volcanic sand that bogged down men and machines alike. There was no cover, no concealment. They were completely exposed to the interlocking fields of fire from hundreds of hidden Japanese positions. Mortar rounds and artillery shells rained down with terrifying precision, while machine gun fire swept the beach from cleverly concealed pillboxes. Entire units were pinned down at the water's edge, unable to advance, their ranks being shredded with each passing minute. Basilone's company was trapped. They were caught in a brutal kill zone. The advance stalled before it had even truly begun. Chaos and fear threatened to paralyze the young Marines. It was a moment that demanded extraordinary leadership, the kind that could only come from a man who had stared into the abyss before and had not flinched. Once again, John Basilone rose to the occasion. Seeing his men pinned down and being systematically slaughtered, he took decisive action. He was no longer a sergeant commanding a static machine gun section. He was now a dynamic infantry leader. He knew the only way to survive was to get off the beach, to move forward and take the fight to the enemy. With a complete disregard for his own safety, he got to his feet and began to move among his terrified men, his voice cutting through the deafening roar of battle. He directed them, organized them, and personally led them forward, off the beach and toward the nearest Japanese strongpoint, a heavily fortified blockhouse that was pouring devastating fire onto the landing zone. He was a whirlwind of controlled aggression. He directed one of his machine gun teams to set up and provide suppressing fire on the blockhouse's embrasures. While the Japanese gunners were forced to keep their heads down, Basilone moved. He single-handedly flanked the position, using the scant cover of shell craters and blasted terrain. Armed with grenades and demolition charges, he attacked the blockhouse from its blind side. He destroyed the position, silencing the guns that had been wreaking havoc on the beach. His singular act of courage had broken the stalemate in his sector, creating a breach in the Japanese defenses that allowed the Marines around him to finally move inland. But there was no time to rest. The advance was a brutal, yard-by-yard slog against a nearly invisible enemy. Basilone continued to lead from the front. He saw a platoon of Marine tanks that were trapped, unable to navigate a treacherous minefield under heavy fire. Again, he took the initiative. He guided one of the Sherman tanks, walking ahead of it despite the mines and the constant enemy fire, directing it through the obstacles and towards the next line of enemy bunkers. He was fighting the battle on his own terms, adapting his tactics to the situation, always moving, always attacking, inspiring every man who saw him. In just a few short hours on the black sands of Iwo Jima, John Basilone had once again proven himself to be a combat leader of unparalleled skill and bravery. Having guided the Marine tank through the treacherous minefield, Basilone's work was still not done. The tank's cannon was now a crucial asset, but it was blind to the camouflaged pillboxes that still dotted the landscape. He became its eyes, directing its fire, pointing out targets, and orchestrating a symphony of destruction against the Japanese fortifications. He was leading a combined arms assault, improvising tactics on the fly in the crucible of combat. His objective was now the edge of Motoyama Airfield No. 1, a key strategic prize on the island. The ground leading to it was a killing field, swept by fire from yet more reinforced concrete bunkers. For the infantry, a direct assault would be suicidal. Basilone knew he had to get his machine gun teams into a position where they could suppress those bunkers and support the riflemen's advance. He personally led one of his teams toward a destroyed Japanese blockhouse, recognizing its thick concrete walls could provide them with some measure of cover. They were moving across open ground, a mad dash through a storm of bullets and shrapnel. They made it to the relative safety of the blockhouse, set up their gun, and began to lay down a withering base of fire on the enemy positions. Their actions immediately relieved some of the pressure on the advancing companies. But as Basilone stood on top of the blockhouse to get a better vantage point, directing his gunners' fire and scanning for new threats, a Japanese mortar shell, arcing high into the sky, found its mark. The explosion was a blinding flash, a concussive wave of force and razor-sharp metal fragments. John Basilone and 4 of his men were hit. The hero of Guadalcanal, the man who had survived the night of 1,000 banzai charges, the man who had single-handedly broken the deadlock on Red Beach, fell to the black volcanic sand. He was killed almost instantly. The news of his death spread quietly among the men of his unit, a somber note amidst the unceasing violence of the battle. It seemed incomprehensible that a man who had seemed so indestructible, so much a force of nature, could be gone. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone was just 28 years old. For his extraordinary heroism in getting his men off the beach and destroying the enemy blockhouse, he would be posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. He became the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. His legacy, however, transcends the medals and citations. His story is a powerful testament to the character of the American fighting man in the Second World War. He was not a general or a strategist, but a non-commissioned officer who embodied the highest ideals of leadership, courage, and dedication to his men. His first epic stand on Guadalcanal was a masterclass in defensive warfare, a demonstration of how one determined man, master of his weapon, could thwart the flawed doctrine of an entire army. His final heroic charge on Iwo Jima was a display of offensive leadership, a showcase of adaptability and selfless courage in the face of impossible odds. He was the rock on which the enemy wave broke on Guadalcanal, and he was the spearhead that pierced the enemy's fortress on Iwo Jima. He chose to return to the furnace of war when he could have safely remained a celebrated hero at home. That choice speaks volumes about his character. He was a man who defined himself not by the accolades he received, but by the duty he performed and the responsibility he felt for the young Marines he led. His life was a refutation of the idea that heroes are born of grand gestures. John Basilone was a hero forged in the mud, in the relentless performance of his duty, and in the quiet, unyielding determination to stand his ground and protect the men to his left and his right. He remains one of the titans of Marine Corps history, a symbol of everything the uniform represents. John Basilone's story did not end on the black sands of Iwo Jima. It transformed into a powerful, enduring legend, a foundational narrative within the United States Marine Corps, and a poignant chapter in the history of the Second World War. His body was eventually returned to his home state of New Jersey, where he was laid to rest in the Arlington National Cemetery, a place reserved for the nation's most revered military figures. The man from the small town of Raritan, who had simply wanted to do his duty, had earned his place among giants. His legacy is multifaceted. Tactically, his actions on Guadalcanal provided a stark, bloody lesson on the battlefield. The battle for Henderson Field was a turning point not just for the campaign, but for the American understanding of the Japanese soldier. It stripped away the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the Imperial Army since Pearl Harbor. It demonstrated that fanatical courage, when pitted against well-prepared defenses and overwhelming sustained firepower, was a recipe for annihilation. Basilone, with his M1917, was the fulcrum of that brutal equation. He personified the American ability to counter the Japanese emphasis on spirit, with a lethal combination of technology, logistics, and the indomitable spirit of the individual GI. Strategically, the victory he helped secure on Guadalcanal was the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. It halted their expansion in the Pacific and initiated the long, brutal island-hopping campaign that would ultimately lead to Tokyo. Henderson Field, the prize for which so much blood was spilled, became a vital springboard for subsequent Allied operations, a dagger pointed at the heart of the Japanese defensive perimeter. But beyond the tactics and strategy, Basilone's most profound legacy is a human one. He represents a unique archetype of the American hero. He was not a reluctant warrior, but a professional who embraced his craft. He was not an officer making decisions from a map. He was an NCO leading from the front, sharing the same risks as his men. His decision to voluntarily return to combat is perhaps the most defining aspect of his story. In an era where fame could provide a safe exit from the horrors of war, he chose to go back. This act elevates his story from one of battlefield heroism to one of profound moral courage and unwavering commitment to his comrades. He demonstrated that true leadership is not about privilege or rank, but about service and sacrifice. In the years following the war, his name became synonymous with the ethos of the Marine NCO. The Corps has honored him in countless ways. Destroyers have been named the USS Basilone. Buildings and rifle ranges bear his name, and his story is taught to every new recruit as the epitome of Marine valor. He is not just a historical figure, he is a standard. He is the benchmark against which generations of Marines have measured their own courage and devotion to duty. The tale of John Manila John Basilone is more than just a war story. It is a timeless narrative about the incredible impact one individual can have in the face of overwhelming odds. It is the story of how a butcher's son from New Jersey became an unbreakable wall on one island and an unstoppable spear on another. It is a reminder that in the grand, impersonal sweep of history, which is so often defined by armies and nations, the outcome of pivotal moments can sometimes rest on the burned hands and unbreakable will of a single, determined sergeant.